100 Facts About Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 1. Let us begin our journey into the world of the greatest detective who never lived, yet somehow feels more real than many who have. Close your eyes and imagine the fog-laden streets of Victorian London, where gaslight flickers against cobblestones, and somewhere in the distance, a clock tower chimes. Our story begins not in London, but in the mind of a young doctor named Arthur Conan Doyle, who in 1886 sat down to write a novel that would change literature forever. Doyle was just 27 years old, struggling to build his medical practice in Southsea, Portsmouth, when he began penning a study in scarlet during quiet moments between patients. This first Sherlock Holmes story took him only 3 weeks to write, flowing from his pen with remarkable ease, as though the character of Holmes already existed somewhere, waiting to be discovered. The name itself carries a gentle music to it. Sherlock Holmes. But where did such a distinctive name come from? Doyle drew inspiration from two sources that merged like tributaries forming a river. The surname Holmes was borrowed from the American writer Oliver Wendell Holmes, whom Doyle greatly admired. And Sherlock. That came from a violinist Doyle knew during his time in Southsea, though originally, our detective was nearly christened Sherrinford, a name that hardly has the same ring, does it? When we first meet Sherlock Holmes in the pages of A Study in Scarlet, he is a man of 27 years, the same age as his creator. Picture him in that moment, tall and lean, with a sharp, hawk-like profile and penetrating grey eyes that seem to look not at you, but through you, into the very essence of who you are. Holmes stands just over 6 feet tall, an imposing figure made more striking by his aquiline nose and square, prominent chin that suggests determination and intellect in equal measure. But Holmes is not merely a detective appearing fully formed on Baker Street. Before he became the consulting detective we know, he was a university student, though tellingly, Conan Doyle never specifies which university. Some scholars believe it was Cambridge, others Oxford, but this ambiguity only adds to Holmes's mythic quality. What we do know is that during his university years, the young Holmes was already displaying his remarkable powers of observation and deduction, though he had not yet refined them into the precise instrument they would become. It was during these student days that Holmes first met Victor Trevor, the only friend he made during his 2 years at university. Trevor's father, a justice of the peace, was so impressed by young Holmes's deductions about his past that he suggested the student might turn his analytical gifts into a profession. This single comment planted a seed that would grow into something unprecedented, the world's first and only consulting detective, a profession Holmes quite literally invented for himself because nothing else like it existed. After university, Holmes retreated to rooms in Montague Street, just around the corner from the British Museum, where he spent years perfecting his craft. Imagine those early days, a young man surrounded by books on chemistry, criminal records, and obscure monographs, teaching himself everything from the composition of tobacco ash to the variations in typewriter fonts. He took on small cases, tested his methods, made mistakes, and learned. For years he worked in relative obscurity, developing the extraordinary skills that would later make him famous. During this formative period, Holmes developed his famous method of deduction, though he would be quick to correct anyone who called it merely deduction. His technique actually combines deduction, induction, and abduction, observing tiny details others miss, inferring their significance, and constructing the most likely explanation that accounts for all the facts. He published his findings in articles with titles like The Book of Life, which attempted to explain how one could deduce a person's entire history from momentary observations. Most readers dismissed such claims as impossible fantasy, until they met Holmes and witnessed his method firsthand. It's worth noting that Holmes's powers, while extraordinary, are not supernatural. Conan Doyle took great care to keep Holmes's abilities within the realm of human possibility, even if stretched to their limit. Every deduction Holmes makes is based on observable evidence and logical reasoning, nothing more, nothing less. In this way, Holmes represents the Victorian faith in reason and science, the belief that careful observation and rational thought could unlock any mystery the world presented. And so, by 1881, when Dr. John Watson first encounters Holmes in the chemistry laboratory at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, our detective has already spent years honing his craft, waiting for the world to discover what he has become. Holmes is ready. The only question remaining is whether the world is ready for Sherlock Holmes. Rest now, and when next we speak, we shall follow Holmes and Watson to their famous address on Baker Street, where the greatest adventures in detective fiction await. Chapter 2. Welcome back to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Settle deeper into comfort now, let your breathing slow, and return with me to Victorian London, where our story continues. When Holmes and Watson first decided to share lodgings, they took rooms at a most famous address, 221B, Baker Street. But here's something curious to ponder as you drift. This address didn't actually exist when Conan Doyle wrote his stories. In the 1880s, Baker Street didn't extend far enough to reach number 221. The address was purely fictional, a convenient invention that would later become one of the most famous addresses in all of literature. It's as if Doyle created not just a character, but an entire location that would eventually will itself into existence in the hearts and minds of millions. The rooms at 221B are presided over by Mrs. Hudson, the long-suffering landlady who tolerates Holmes's peculiar habits with remarkable patience. Imagine her climbing those 17 steps to their first-floor apartment, bringing up meals while Holmes conducts chemical experiments that fill the rooms with acrid smoke, or fires his revolver at the wall in patterns that spell out VR for Victoria Regina when he's bored. Mrs. Hudson appears in more stories than any other character except Holmes and Watson themselves, a steady, maternal presence grounding the detective's more eccentric flights. Now, let us paint a picture of these famous rooms where so many adventures begin. The sitting room at 221B faces Baker Street, filled with a comfortable clutter that speaks of two very different men sharing the same space. There are Holmes's chemistry apparatus and scientific instruments scattered about, his violin resting in its case, stacks of newspapers and reference books piled in every corner. Two armchairs sit on either side of the fireplace, Holmes's chair on the left, Watson's on the right, where countless clients will sit and tell their strange tales. Above the mantelpiece, you'll recall, is where Holmes keeps his cigars in the coal scuttle and his tobacco in a Persian slipper, because why use ordinary containers when such colorful alternatives exist? Holmes's mind, much like his rooms, is a carefully curated collection of knowledge, though organized quite differently than you might expect. In A Study in Scarlet, Watson is shocked to discover that Holmes doesn't know the Earth revolves around the sun. But Holmes explains his theory quite logically. The human brain is like an attic with limited space, so one must be selective about what furniture, what knowledge one brings into it. Holmes deliberately keeps himself ignorant of anything that doesn't directly serve his work. Literature, philosophy, astronomy, all useless to a detective, he claims, and therefore not worth the brain space. Of course, this proves not entirely accurate as the stories progress, but it reveals Holmes's intensely practical approach to life. What Holmes does know, he knows extraordinarily well. His knowledge of chemistry is profound and eccentric, focused particularly on poisons and stains, knowledge perfect for a consulting detective. He's written a monograph on the varieties of tobacco ash, enabling him to distinguish at a glance between the ash of 140 different varieties of pipe, cigar, and cigarette tobacco. Imagine the hours of careful study required to achieve such mastery of something so minute, so easily overlooked. This is the essence of Holmes, finding significance in what others dismiss as trivial. And then there is the violin. Holmes is an accomplished violinist, though his relationship with music is as unique as everything else about him. He plays the violin not just to perform composed pieces, but to think. When working on a difficult case, he'll sit in his armchair with his violin, playing long, improvisational passages, sometimes melodic, sometimes mere scraping and soaring, losing himself in the music as his mind works through the puzzle before him. Watson often mentions waking in the night to hear Holmes playing in the darkness, the notes drifting through the sitting room like audible thoughts. The violin Holmes plays, we learn in the cardboard box, is a Stradivarius worth at least 500 guineas, an extraordinary instrument for an extraordinary mind. Holmes's methods extend beyond mere observation to physical disguise and performance. He is a master of disguise, so skilled that he repeatedly fools even Watson, his closest companion. In A Scandal in Bohemia, he appears as a drunken groom, and later as a clergyman. In The Empty House, he disguises himself as an elderly book collector so convincingly that Watson doesn't recognize him even in close conversation. Holmes doesn't simply put on a costume, he becomes another person entirely, altering his posture, his voice, his mannerisms until the transformation is complete. This theatrical talent suggests that Holmes, had he chosen differently, might have been as successful on the stage as in detection. Speaking of drama, Holmes has a flair for the theatrical reveal. He doesn't simply solve cases, he orchestrates their solutions like a conductor leading an orchestra to its crescendo. He deliberately withholds information from Watson and the police, not from any malice, but because he understands the power of narrative and revelation. Watch how often he gathers everyone together at the story's end to explain his deductions, laying out each logical step like a magician revealing how a trick was done, except Holmes's trick is no illusion, but pure reason made visible. But beneath the brilliance and the theatricality, there is something else to Holmes, a darkness, a restlessness that Watson observes with concern. When there are no cases to occupy his tremendous mind, Holmes falls into black moods. He can spend days lying on the sofa, hardly moving, barely speaking, sunk in what Watson recognizes as a profound melancholy. It's during these periods that Holmes engages in what Watson calls his only vice, though this vice deserves its own consideration, which will come in time. For now, simply observe that genius and darkness often walk hand in hand, and Holmes's brilliant mind requires constant stimulation or it turns inward, consuming itself. Yet when a case arrives, when Mrs. Hudson shows up a client or a telegram summons them to some mystery, watch how Holmes transforms. The languid figure rises from the sofa, the dull eyes suddenly gleam with that fierce intelligence, and he becomes alive again, fully present and focused. The game is afoot, he'll cry, borrowing Shakespeare's phrase, and Watson knows that once again, the greatest mind he's ever encountered has found its purpose. This transformation, this oscillation between boredom and brilliant activity, defines Holmes's existence. He is a man who needs mystery the way others need air. Rest now in these comfortable rooms on Baker Street, where the fire crackles softly and rain patters against the window. When next we meet, we shall explore the cases that made Sherlock Holmes a legend. Chapter 3. Let your thoughts settle like leaves on still water as we continue our gentle journey through the life and times of Sherlock Holmes. Among all the adventures that came to 221B, Baker Street, one stands apart in Holmes's memory and affections. A Scandal in Bohemia introduces us to Irene Adler, an American opera singer who becomes the only woman to ever truly impress Sherlock Holmes. She is always referred to by Holmes as the woman, not a woman, but the woman, as if no other could ever hold such significance. Yet this is not a tale of romance in the conventional sense. Holmes doesn't love Irene Adler in any romantic way. Rather, he admires her intelligence, her cunning, her ability to outwit him. She is, quite simply, the one who got away not with his heart, but with his pride. And for Holmes, that may be even more meaningful. Watson, our faithful narrator, tells us that he kept notes on 70 cases during the years 1881 and 1882 alone, though he published accounts of only a fraction of these. Imagine the stories left untold, gathering dust in Watson's old dispatch box, each one a mystery we'll never fully know. Some are mentioned in passing: the adventure of the tired captain, the matter of the Vatican cameos, the affair of the aluminum crutch, tantalizing titles that spark the imagination but remain forever incomplete, like half-remembered dreams. Now, let us speak of Holmes's habits, both productive and concerning. Holmes is a man of extraordinary energy when engaged in a case, often going days without sleep, driven by the pure momentum of investigation. Watson describes how Holmes can subsist on nothing but coffee and tobacco for days on end when pursuing a solution, his mind racing too quickly to be bothered with mundane needs like food or rest. But this intensity comes at a cost, and when the case is done, Holmes collapses, sometimes sleeping for 12 or 14 hours straight, his body reclaiming what was denied it. Among Holmes's many skills is his extensive knowledge of London. He knows the city intimately, every street, every alley, every shortcut and back entrance. This geographical mastery allows him to navigate London like a chess master moving pieces across a board, always knowing the quickest route, the best vantage point, the ideal spot for an ambush or an observation. In several stories, Holmes demonstrates an almost supernatural ability to track criminals through the maze of Victorian London, as if the city itself whispers its secrets to him. Holmes also possesses considerable physical strength and is an expert at Baritsu, a form of Japanese martial arts that combines jiu-jitsu and other fighting techniques. This becomes crucially important at Reichenbach Falls, but we shall come to that moment in its proper time. For now, simply know that Holmes is not merely a thinking machine, he is also a man of action, capable of defending himself and others when reasoning must give way to physicality. Watson mentions that Holmes has extraordinarily strong hands and once straightened a bent steel poker that had been twisted by a violent visitor, demonstrating his quiet but formidable strength. The detective's work brings him into contact with the official police force, particularly Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Lestrade appears in more stories than any other police inspector, and his relationship with Holmes is fascinatingly complex. The inspector is simultaneously grateful for Holmes's help and resentful of his superiority, often taking credit for solutions that Holmes provided. Yet there's also genuine respect between them. Lestrade is sharp enough to know when he's out of his depth, and humble enough to call on Holmes when truly baffling cases arise. He represents the best of what the official police can be: dedicated, honest, if somewhat limited in imagination. Holmes's brother Mycroft offers another window into the detective's world. Mycroft Holmes is introduced in The Greek Interpreter, and here we learn something extraordinary. Mycroft's powers of observation and deduction are actually superior to Sherlock's. Yes, you heard correctly, there exists a man even more brilliant than Sherlock Holmes, and he is his own brother. But Mycroft lacks ambition and energy. He cannot be bothered with the legwork of investigation. Instead, he works for the British government in what Holmes vaguely describes as an accounting position, though we later learn that Mycroft essentially is the British government in many ways, the person who knows everything and advises on everything. On certain matters, Holmes tells Watson, Mycroft is the most indispensable man in the country. The Holmes brothers have an interesting arrangement. Several times a week, Mycroft can be found at the Diogenes Club, one of the most peculiar establishments in London. The Diogenes Club was founded for men who, for whatever reason, are unsociable and prefer not to interact with others. In this club, talking is forbidden except in the stranger's room, and members sit in comfortable silence, reading newspapers or books, existing in proximity without the burden of conversation. It's the perfect environment for Mycroft, who values his routines above all else, and it tells us something about where Sherlock's own solitary tendencies might lead if unchecked by the stimulation of detective work. It's enormous sums, yet he also regularly takes on cases for nothing when the problem interests him or when the client cannot afford to pay. My professional charges are upon a fixed scale, he tells one client. I do not vary them, save when I remit them altogether. This suggests a man motivated not by money but by intellectual challenge and, perhaps, a sense of justice. The cases Holmes remembers most fondly are rarely the ones that paid best, but rather those that presented the most interesting puzzles or the most unusual circumstances. In his methods of investigation, Holmes is thoroughly modern, even ahead of his time. He maintains extensive records and indexes of newspaper clippings, criminal records, and personal observations. His files are legendary, organized, cross-referenced, immediately accessible. When a case comes to him, he can often pull out previous examples, similar crimes, patterns that have emerged over years of careful documentation. This systematic approach to criminal investigation was quite revolutionary for the Victorian era, foreshadowing the development of modern forensic science and criminal databases. Holmes understood that information, properly organized and analyzed, is itself a form of power. Rest now, and let these images drift through your mind like fog through London streets. The detective sits in his chair, his long fingers pressed together in thought, while the city murmurs outside. When we meet again, we shall venture into the darker corners of Holmes's world, where his greatest enemy awaits. Chapter 4. Breathe slowly, settle deeper, and return once more to the gaslit world of Sherlock Holmes. Our story now takes us into shadow, for every great detective must have an equally great adversary. In the spring of 1891, Holmes encountered the man he would call the Napoleon of crime, Professor James Moriarty. Imagine a man who sits at the center of a vast criminal web, like a spider feeling every tremor along its strands. Moriarty is a mathematics professor turned criminal mastermind, and Holmes tells Watson that half the crimes committed in London can be traced back to this one brilliant, malevolent mind. Yet Moriarty operates so carefully, so cleverly, that the police don't even know he exists. He is the perfect criminal, which makes him the perfect antagonist for the perfect detective. Holmes had been working for months to bring down Moriarty's organization, gathering evidence piece by piece like a patient craftsman assembling a mosaic. But Moriarty is no ordinary criminal. He realizes what Holmes is doing and comes to Baker Street to warn him off. Picture this scene: the two greatest minds in London, sitting across from each other in Holmes's sitting room, each recognizing in the other a rare intellectual equal. Moriarty is thin and ascetic-looking, with a face that projects forward and oscillates slowly from side to side in a curiously reptilian fashion, as Holmes describes. It's a meeting of titans, cordial on the surface, but thrumming with deadly tension beneath. When Holmes refuses to abandon his investigation, Moriarty promises that if Holmes continues, he will ensure the detective's death. And so begins the famous chase across Europe, with Holmes and Watson fleeing England just hours ahead of Moriarty's assassins. They travel through France, bound eventually for Switzerland, staying always one step ahead of pursuit. Can you imagine the strange journey? The great detective, usually in control of every situation, now himself the hunted? And yet there's something almost exhilarating in Holmes's accounts of this chase, as if he's finally found a challenge worthy of his abilities. The pursuit ends at Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, a place of terrible beauty where water thunders down into a chasm in clouds of spray and mist. On May 4, 1891, Holmes and Moriarty meet at this precipice for their final confrontation. There are no witnesses to what happens next. Watson has been called away by a clever ruse, but the evidence suggests they fought, and both men went over the falls together, locked in a death struggle. Holmes leaves a note for Watson, a farewell letter that reads like a last will and testament, explaining that death at Moriarty's hands is preferable to death at the hangman's, for at least this way his reputation remains intact. The literary world was shocked when The Final Problem, published in December 1893, appeared to end with Holmes's death. But here's something you may not know: Arthur Conan Doyle was relieved. He had grown tired of writing Holmes' stories, feeling they distracted him from what he considered more important historical novels. Doyle's mother pleaded with him not to kill Holmes, but he was determined. "I must save my mind for better things," he wrote, "even if it means I must bury my pocketbook with him." And so Sherlock Holmes died at Reichenbach Falls, or so the world believed. But the public would not let Holmes rest. Readers wore black armbands in mourning. More than 20,000 people cancelled their subscriptions to the Strand magazine in protest. Letters poured in begging Doyle to bring Holmes back. For 8 years, Doyle resisted, but eventually the pressure and, admittedly, the financial incentive proved too great. In 1901, The Hound of the Baskervilles was published, though Doyle claimed it was a case from before Holmes's death. Finally, in 1903, The Adventure of the Empty House revealed the truth: Holmes had survived. Holmes explains to an astounded Watson that only Moriarty fell that day. Holmes had used his knowledge of Baritsu to throw Moriarty over the edge while escaping the fall himself. He then climbed up the cliff face and fled, allowing the world to believe him dead because several of Moriarty's most dangerous associates were still at large. For 3 years, a period Watson calls the Great Hiatus, Holmes traveled in disguise through Tibet, Persia, Mecca, and Khartoum, even spending time in France researching coal tar derivatives. All this time, only Mycroft knew he was alive, sending him money and news when needed. When Holmes finally reveals himself to Watson in the empty house, Watson faints, the only time in all their adventures that the sturdy doctor loses consciousness. It's a testament to the depth of Watson's grief over losing his friend, and the shock of discovering that grief was unnecessary. Holmes apologizes for the deception but explains it was essential for Watson's safety. Had Watson known Holmes was alive, his behavior might have given it away to Moriarty's remaining assassins. During his absence, Holmes grew a beard and traveled under various disguises, appearing as a Norwegian explorer named Sigurdsson among other personas. He describes spending time with the head lama in Tibet and visiting Khalifa in Khartoum, experiences that must have been extraordinary for a man who had spent most of his life in the confines of London. What did Holmes think about during those long years away? Did he miss the detective work, the intellectual puzzles? Or was there relief in the freedom, the absence of expectation? These questions remain unanswered, but they suggest hidden depths to Holmes's character. During his absence, Holmes grew a beard and traveled under various disguises, appearing as a Norwegian explorer named Sigurdsson among other personas. He describes spending time with the head lama in Tibet and visiting Khalifa in Khartoum, experiences that must have been extraordinary for a man who had spent most of his life in the confines of London. What did Holmes think about during those long years away? Did he miss the detective work, the intellectual puzzles? Or was there relief in the freedom, the absence of expectation? These questions remain unanswered, but they suggest hidden depths to Holmes's character. The period after Holmes's return is sometimes considered the later period of his career, and there's a subtle difference in the detective we encounter. He seems perhaps slightly softer, more willing to show affection for Watson, more likely to smile or make a gentle joke. The brush with mortality at Reichenbach Falls may have changed him in ways he would never explicitly acknowledge. Or perhaps Doyle himself, now resigned to writing Holmes stories for the rest of his career, brought a different energy to the character, less resentful, more accepting of the detective's place in his life. Rest now, and know that even the greatest detective must face darkness before finding light again. The fire burns low in the grate at Baker Street, and outside, the city settles into its evening rhythms. When we meet again, we shall explore the later adventures and the mysteries that still called to Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 5. Let your mind drift like smoke from Holmes's pipe as we continue our peaceful exploration of the detective's world. Settle into the quiet comfort of these stories, told not for excitement, but for the gentle pleasure of knowing. Among all the cases that came to Baker Street, one stands as perhaps the most famous and atmospheric, The Hound of the Baskervilles. Published in 1901, this novel was actually based on a legend Conan Doyle heard from a friend, Fletcher Robinson, who told him about the ghostly black dogs said to haunt the moors of Dartmoor in Devon. Doyle was so taken with this tale that he initially planned to write it as a standalone story, but then realized it would be perfect for Holmes. And so we have this masterpiece, a story that blends gothic horror with detective reasoning, where ancient curses meet modern deduction on the misty expanses of the moor. The Baskerville case takes Holmes and Watson to the countryside, away from the familiar streets of London. Here we see Holmes operating in a very different environment, one where fog and isolation replace gaslight and crowds. The case involves an ancient family curse, a mysterious hound that glows with spectral fire, and Sir Henry Baskerville, who has inherited both a title and a legacy of terror. Holmes's approach to this seemingly supernatural problem is characteristically rational. He never believes in the ghost hound for a moment, instead seeking the human hand behind the legend. Watson plays a larger role in The Hound of the Baskervilles than in many other stories. Holmes sends Watson to Dartmoor to protect Sir Henry and observe events, trusting his friend's reliability even as Watson himself worries he lacks Holmes's brilliance. We see Watson keeping detailed notes, making observations, trying to think as Holmes would think. And when Holmes finally reveals he's been on the moor all along, secretly investigating while Watson thought himself alone, it's both a typical Holmes trick and a testament to how much the detective trusts Watson to lay the groundwork. Now let us speak of Watson himself more fully, for he is far more than merely Holmes's chronicler. Dr. John H. Watson served as an army surgeon in Afghanistan, where he was wounded at the Battle of Maiwand in 1880, though interestingly, Watson is inconsistent about whether he was shot in the shoulder or the leg, a discrepancy that has delighted Holmes scholars for generations. He returned to London with a military pension, his health shattered, looking for affordable lodgings when a mutual acquaintance suggested he meet a young man named Sherlock Holmes who was also seeking a roommate. Watson is a medical doctor, trained at the University of London, and took his degree from Bart's St. Bartholomew's Hospital, the same place where he and Holmes first met. Throughout the stories, Watson's medical knowledge proves invaluable, not just in treating injuries but in understanding causes of death, effects of poisons, and other forensic details. He is Holmes's perfect complement, practical where Holmes is theoretical, grounded where Holmes is mercurial, conventional where Holmes is eccentric. The good doctor marries at least once, to Mary Morstan, whom he meets in The Sign of Four. Mary comes to Baker Street seeking help in unraveling a mystery involving her father's disappearance and a strange series of pearls she's been receiving annually. Watson falls in love with her during the case, and Holmes, with his typical emotional detachment, congratulates Watson but notes that the marriage will mean losing his ideal biographer and companion. Mary is a gentle, intelligent woman who understands Watson's devotion to Holmes. Though her presence in the stories is limited, she dies at some point between cases, though Doyle never tells us how or when, leaving Watson to return to Baker Street and his old life with Holmes. Holmes himself never marries, never even shows romantic interest in anyone except perhaps a distant admiration for Irene Adler. When Watson suggests he should find a domestic partner, Holmes dismisses the idea entirely. "I am a brain, Watson," he says, "the rest of me is a mere appendix. Love, marriage, family, these are distractions from the work, emotions that would cloud the pure reason he values above all else." Yet there's something poignant in this, isn't there? A man so brilliant he cannot allow himself the simple human connections that give life meaning for others. Let us drift now to Holmes's more problematic habit, his use of cocaine. In several early stories, Watson describes Holmes injecting himself with a 7% solution of cocaine when there are no cases to occupy his mind. This was not particularly shocking to Victorian readers. Cocaine was legal and even marketed as a wonder drug at the time. But Watson, as a doctor, recognizes it as harmful and frequently remonstrates with Holmes about it. The detective's response is always the same: his brain rebels at stagnation, and without cases to solve, he needs artificial stimulation to prevent his mind from consuming itself. By the later stories, Watson notes with relief that Holmes has largely given up the drug habit. Whether this reflects changing social attitudes toward cocaine or a genuine character development in Holmes is left ambiguous. But it reminds us that Holmes, for all his brilliance, is human, vulnerable to boredom, to depression, to the same weaknesses that afflict lesser minds. His genius is not purely a gift, it's also a burden, a restless energy that demands constant outlet. Holmes's methods influenced real criminal investigation more than you might imagine. He frequently emphasizes the importance of preserving crime scenes, of examining evidence before it's disturbed, of making detailed observations before forming theories. These ideas seem obvious now, but in the late Victorian era, they were relatively novel. Police work was often haphazard, crime scenes were trampled by curious onlookers, and evidence was contaminated or destroyed. Holmes's fictional methods helped educate both police and public about the importance of forensic care. Dr. Edmond Locard, who established the world's first crime investigation laboratory in Lyon, France, credited Sherlock Holmes as an inspiration, saying Sherlock Holmes was the first to realize the importance of dust. "I merely copied him." Rest now in these peaceful thoughts. Outside Baker Street, the lamplighter makes his rounds, touching flame to gas and bringing light to the London evening. Tomorrow there will be new mysteries, but tonight, there is only the quiet comfort of stories told and sleep approaching. When next we meet, we shall explore more of the cases and curiosities that made Holmes immortal. Chapter 6. Breathe deeply and return once more to our journey through the world of Sherlock Holmes. Let the details wash over you like a gentle tide, each fact a stone smoothed by the passage of time. The stories of Sherlock Holmes were published across several decades, and they appeared in a very particular format that shaped how the world came to know the detective. Most of the short stories were first published in the Strand magazine, a monthly British publication that brought literature to the middle classes. Beginning in July 1891 with A Scandal in Bohemia, the Strand featured a new Holmes story almost every month for years, each one accompanied by illustrations that helped readers visualize the detective. These monthly installments meant that for Victorian readers, Holmes was not a character to be consumed all at once, but a regular visitor, arriving predictably each month like an old friend. The illustrations for these stories were crucial to establishing Holmes's iconic image. Sidney Paget was the artist who drew most of the original Strand illustrations, and it was Paget who gave Holmes the deerstalker cap and the Inverness cape that have become inseparable from the character's image. Curiously, Conan Doyle never specifically describes Holmes wearing these items. Paget added them because they seemed appropriate for a gentleman detective working in the countryside. And yet now, we cannot imagine Holmes without them. Paget's brother Walter actually served as the model for many of the illustrations, making Holmes more handsome than Doyle had originally envisioned him. Holmes was supposed to be striking rather than attractive, but Paget's drawings softened this considerably. During his career, Holmes handles 56 short stories and 4 novels worth of cases, at least those that Watson publishes. But Watson hints at many more hundreds, perhaps, that were too delicate to publish, or too mundane to be interesting, or simply lost among the papers in that famous tin dispatch box. Sometimes Watson teases us with titles. The Adventure of the Giant Rat of Sumatra, he mentions, adding that the world is not yet prepared for that story. These tantalizing references have sparked endless speculation among Holmes enthusiasts about what remarkable cases remain forever untold. Holmes's fame spreads beyond Baker Street, and he is occasionally consulted by European royalty and heads of state. In A Scandal in Bohemia, his client is actually the King of Bohemia himself, who comes to Holmes in disguise before revealing his identity. In other stories, Holmes receives emeralds from the Queen of Holland and is offered a knighthood by the King of England, though he refuses the honor. This international recognition speaks to Holmes's reputation. He is not merely London's greatest detective, but perhaps the world's, consulted when conventional police and governmental resources fail. The detective maintains a commonplace book, a large scrapbook where he pastes newspaper clippings, notes from cases, and observations about criminal methods. This book becomes a reference work he consults frequently, cross-referencing current cases with similar past crimes to identify patterns and methods. In several stories, Holmes pulls out this book to show Watson parallel cases, demonstrating how criminal minds often work in similar ways. The commonplace book represents Holmes's conviction that knowledge, systematically organized, is the detective's most powerful tool. Holmes has published several monographs during his career, establishing himself as an authority on various specialized subjects. Beyond his work on tobacco ash, he has written upon the distinction between the ashes of the various tobaccos, a technical analysis of different types of typewriters and their characteristics, and the tracing of footsteps with remarks upon the uses of plaster of Paris as a preserver of impressions. These are not popular works but academic treatises, read by specialists and investigators. They reveal Holmes's scholarly side. He is not content merely to solve crimes, he must also systematize his knowledge, contributing to what he hopes will become a science of detection. Among Holmes's cases, one involves a particularly unusual client, a young woman named Violet Hunter, who comes to consult him about a strange job offer in the adventure of the Copper Beaches. She has been offered an unusually high salary to work as a governess, but with peculiar conditions. She must cut her hair short and wear a specific electric blue dress at certain times. Holmes initially advises against taking the position, but Violet does so anyway, and Holmes and Watson must eventually come to her rescue. This case is notable because Holmes admits at the end that the countryside is far more dangerous than the city, a reversal of the usual Victorian assumption that rural areas were safe and wholesome while cities bred crime. The relationship between Holmes and Scotland Yard is endlessly fascinating. Besides Lestrade, Holmes works with several other inspectors including Gregson, Hopkins, and Athelney Jones. These official detectives have varying levels of competence and varying degrees of respect for Holmes. Some, like Stanley Hopkins, genuinely admire Holmes and seek to learn from him. Others tolerate him only because they need his help. And yet, despite solving case after case for them, Holmes remains an outsider. He is not officially recognized, not part of the establishment, forever the consulting detective working on the margins of official law enforcement. The relationship between Holmes and Scotland Yard is endlessly fascinating. Besides Lestrade, Holmes works with several other inspectors including Gregson, Hopkins, and Athelney Jones. These official detectives have varying levels of competence and varying degrees of respect for Holmes. Some, like Stanley Hopkins, genuinely admire Holmes and seek to learn from him. Others tolerate him only because they need his help. And yet, despite solving case after case for them, Holmes remains an outsider. He is not officially recognized, not part of the establishment, forever the consulting detective working on the margins of official law enforcement. Holmes's retirement comes, eventually, as it must for all of us. Around 1903 or 1904, Holmes retires to Sussex Downs where he takes up beekeeping and writes a practical handbook on the subject, titled Practical Handbook of Bee Culture, with some observations upon the segregation of the queen. One imagines Holmes on the South Downs, finally at peace, watching his bees work with the same careful attention he once gave to criminals. The man who could not bear idleness has found at last an occupation that satisfies his need for observation and care without the darkness of crime. There is something beautiful in this, the great detective finding contentment in the smallest of creatures, the intricate societies of bees replacing the criminal networks of London. Yet even in retirement, Holmes cannot entirely escape his past. In his last beau, Set in August 1914 on the eve of World War I, an older Holmes comes out of retirement for one final case, capturing a German spy on behalf of the British government. Watson, now in his 60s, joins him for this last adventure. The story ends with Holmes and Watson standing together looking out over the sea, Holmes reflecting on the coming war with uncharacteristic emotion. "There's an east wind coming, Watson," he says, speaking not of weather but of the great conflict about to engulf Europe. It's a melancholy ending, the detective and the doctor together as they have always been, facing an uncertain future with courage born of long friendship. Rest now, knowing that all stories, even the greatest, must end. But endings are not always sad, sometimes they are simply peaceful, like Holmes among his bees, like Watson writing by lamplight, like you now, drifting toward sleep. When we meet again, we shall explore the legacy Holmes left behind and the world he continues to inhabit. Chapter 7. Let your thoughts become as soft as candlelight flickering against the walls of 221B, Baker Street. We continue our quiet exploration of the detective's world, where each detail is a doorway into something larger. The stories of Sherlock Holmes span a remarkable period in Watson's chronicles, from 1878, when Holmes first established himself as a consulting detective, all the way through 1914. This gives us nearly 40 years of adventures, watching Holmes evolve from a young man of 24 to a retired gentleman in his 60s. Few literary characters are given such breadth of life, such room to age and change. We see Holmes in his energetic youth, his confident prime, and his reflective later years, each period bringing its own texture to the tales. Among the many colorful characters who populate Holmes's world, none are more memorable than the Baker Street irregulars. These are a group of street children, urchins, as the Victorians called them, whom Holmes employs as his eyes and ears throughout London. Led by a boy named Wiggins, these children can go places and hear things that would be impossible for an adult detective. They blend into the street scene, invisible to those who matter, and yet seeing everything. Holmes pays them well for their services, a shilling a day, plus expenses, and they are fiercely loyal to him. There's something touching about Holmes's relationship with these children. He treats them with respect, values their intelligence, and gives them purpose and income they might not otherwise have. Holmes's methods extend to the careful study of handwriting, and he can identify not just forgeries but can deduce remarkable things about a person from their penmanship. In The Reigate Squire, he analyzes handwriting to determine that two people of the same family wrote different parts of a note, and further deduces their relationship and characteristics from the style of their writing. Holmes believes that handwriting reveals character as surely as fingerprints reveal identity, perhaps even more so, since handwriting shows not just who you are, but how you think and feel as you write. The detective is also deeply knowledgeable about British law and sensational crime history. He can cite legal precedents, knows the details of famous cases going back decades, and understands the technical aspects of criminal prosecution. In The Adventure of the Noble Bachelor, he casually references several historical cases to Watson while explaining his deductions. This encyclopedic knowledge of crime serves Holmes the way a doctor's knowledge of past cases informs diagnosis. Each new mystery is illuminated by the patterns of those that came before. Holmes's face is described as having an alert, hawk-like expression, and his eyes are particularly notable. They can be sharp and piercing when he's focused on a problem, or dreamy and languid when he's bored. Watson often mentions how Holmes's entire demeanor transforms when a case interests him. The dull, languorous look vanishes, replaced by intense concentration and barely contained energy. It's as if two different people inhabit the same body, the bored Holmes who lounges on the sofa for days, and the energized Holmes who can work for 72 hours straight without rest when pursuing a solution. In The Sign of 4, Holmes displays his knowledge of London's river and docks, tracking a boat along the Thames with intimate knowledge of tides, boat speeds, and the maze of waterways that thread through the city. This case also introduces us to Toby, a remarkable tracking dog that Holmes borrows to follow a scent trail across London. The image of Holmes, Watson, and Toby moving through the nighttime streets, following a trail invisible to human senses, captures something essential about Holmes's work: the ability to perceive what others cannot, whether through reason, observation, or borrowed senses. Holmes occasionally quotes literature and philosophy, despite his claimed ignorance of such subjects. He is particularly fond of quoting Goethe, the German writer and philosopher, and in several stories references Shakespeare, though he claims such knowledge is useless for a detective. This contradiction suggests that Holmes's brain attic theory may be more affectation than reality, or perhaps that despite his best efforts to exclude useless knowledge, some of it seeps in anyway, enriching his mind whether he admits it or not. The detective has been known to go undercover for extended periods, fully inhabiting another identity. In A Scandal in Bohemia, he spends an entire day as a groom, working in the stables and listening to gossip. In The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton, he becomes engaged to a housemaid to gain access to a blackmailer's house, an action Watson considers ethically questionable, though Holmes dismisses such concerns as sentimentality. These deep disguises show Holmes's theatrical abilities extending beyond mere costume. He can adopt another person's mannerisms, speech patterns, and even psychology, becoming them so completely that the deception is nearly impossible to detect. Watson's writing style and publication of the cases creates an interesting relationship between the doctor and his subject. Holmes frequently criticizes Watson's accounts as being too sensational, too focused on the dramatic rather than the intellectual process. "You have degraded what should have been a course of lectures into a series of tales," Holmes complains in The Adventure of the Copper Beeches. Yet despite these complaints, Holmes allows Watson to continue publishing, suggesting he values the friendship and perhaps even the fame more than he admits. There's a tender irony here. Holmes claims not to care about public opinion, yet he permits and even facilitates his own legend through Watson's stories. The final story written by Conan Doyle, The Adventure of Shoscomolde Place, was published in 1927, though it's set much earlier, probably around 1902. By this time, Doyle was 6 to 7 years old and had been writing Holmes stories for over 40 years. This last tale is quieter than some of the more famous adventures, involving horses, bones, and family secrets. It lacks the grandeur of the final problem or the atmosphere of The Hound of the Baskervilles, but there's something appropriate about this gentle ending, not with a bang but with a whisper, Holmes solving one more case before the curtain finally falls. Doyle would die 3 years later, in 1930, but Sherlock Holmes would continue living in the hearts and minds of readers, immortal in a way his creator could never be. Rest now, and let these stories settle in your mind like snow falling on London streets, soft and silent. The detective sits in his chair, fingers steepled, thinking thoughts we can only imagine. When we meet again, we shall explore how Holmes transcended his pages to become something more than fiction, a myth that walks among us still. Chapter 8. Breathe slowly, settle deeper into comfort, and return with me to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Tonight we explore how a character born in the pages of a magazine became something far more, a presence that lives beyond paper and ink. Shortly after Holmes's stories began appearing, something remarkable happened. People started writing to Sherlock Holmes directly, sending letters addressed to 221B, Baker Street, as if he were a real person who could solve their actual problems. This phenomenon has never truly stopped. Even today, more than a century later, letters arrive at this address seeking the detective's help. The bank that now occupies the location employs someone to answer this correspondence, maintaining the gentle fiction that Holmes might still be available for consultation. This tells us something profound about the power of story, that a character can become so vivid, so necessary, that reality bends slightly to accommodate him. The stories have been translated into more than 50 languages, carrying Holmes to every corner of the world. In Japan, he became wildly popular during the early 20th century. In Russia, Soviet readers embraced him as a champion of reason and logic. In India, in China, in South America, everywhere the stories traveled, Holmes found eager audiences. This universal appeal speaks to something essential in the character, the belief that observation and reason can solve any puzzle, that truth can be discovered through careful thought. In an uncertain world, Holmes offers the comfort of certainty, of problems that have solutions if only one is clever enough to see them. Conan Doyle himself had a complex relationship with his creation. While Holmes brought him fame and fortune, Doyle longed to be remembered for his historical novels like The White Company or his works on spiritualism, subjects he considered far more important than detective stories. Yet it's Holmes that made him a knight. He was knighted in 1902, becoming Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, ostensibly for his work defending Britain's actions in the Boer War, but undoubtedly his fame as Holmes's creator played a role. The irony must have stung, honored by a king, but forever known as the father of a character he sometimes resented. In his later years, Doyle became deeply involved in spiritualism, believing he could communicate with the dead. He attended séances, wrote books defending the existence of spirits, and even believed in the authenticity of the famous Cottingley fairies photographs, pictures that were later proven to be hoaxes created by 2 young girls with paper cutouts. How strange that the creator of the world's most rational detective should become such an ardent believer in the supernatural. Perhaps it's not so contradictory after all. Both detective work and spiritualism involve seeking what is hidden, believing that truth exists beneath the surface of things. Doyle simply applied his faith in hidden truths to different realms. Holmes's influence on real detective work cannot be overstated. Before Holmes, forensic science barely existed as a formal discipline. Holmes's emphasis on fingerprints, blood analysis, footprint comparison, and preservation of crime scenes helped inspire the development of actual forensic techniques. Police departments around the world began adopting methods that Holmes had popularized in fiction. In this way, Holmes helped create the reality he seemed to inhabit, fiction influencing fact in a loop that continues to this day. The stories have been adapted countless times, more than any other literary character except perhaps Dracula. The first stage adaptation appeared in 1899, with Doyle's approval, starring the American actor William Gillette. Gillette introduced several elements that became permanently associated with Holmes, including the curved calabash pipe, though in the original stories, Holmes smokes straight pipes and cigarettes. Gillette played Holmes over 1,300 times across more than 30 years, shaping the public image of the detective for generations. He was so identified with the role that he preserved his performance in a 1916 silent film, giving us a glimpse of how early audiences experienced Holmes. The character has been portrayed on screen more than any other fictional character. Over 70 actors have played him in over 200 films and television series. Each era reimagines Holmes for its own time. The Holmes of the 1940s Basil Rathbone films fought Nazis. Later versions made him more human, more fallible, more complex. Yet certain elements remain constant. The brilliant mind, the faithful Watson, the rooms on Baker Street, the deerstalker and pipe, the cry of elementary, my dear Watson, though remarkably, this exact phrase never appears in any of Doyle's original stories. It's one of those curious cases where popular culture creates something that feels so right, it becomes retroactively true. The Sherlock Holmes stories belong to a genre we now call detective fiction, but Holmes was there at the genre's very beginning, helping to define what such stories could be. Before Holmes, there was Edgar Allan Poe's C. Auguste Dupin and a few others, but Holmes made the detective story into a major literary form. Nearly every detective who came after, from Hercule Poirot to Miss Marple to modern television detectives, owes something to Holmes. The structure he established, the brilliant detective, the loyal companion who narrates, the puzzle fairly presented to the reader, the dramatic revelation of the solution, became the template for thousands of stories to follow. In 1934, the Sherlock Holmes Society of London was founded, dedicated to studying the stories and keeping the detective's memory alive. Members refer to themselves as Sherlockians in America or Holmesians in Britain, and they engage in what they call the game, the playful pretense that Holmes and Watson were real people and that Conan Doyle was merely Watson's literary agent. They write scholarly papers analyzing inconsistencies in the stories, debating where Watson's war wound really was, or calculating the exact date of various adventures. This elaborate game of treating fiction as reality speaks to the story's enduring power. They create a world so detailed, so convincing, that readers want to live in it, to make it real through attention and scholarship. The Baker Street location itself became a shrine. Though the real 221B didn't exist in Doyle's time, it does now. The building was renumbered to match Holmes's address, and it houses the Sherlock Holmes Museum. Visitors from around the world climb those famous 17 steps, see Watson's chair and Holmes's chemistry set, stand in the room where fictional history was made. The museum maintains the space as if Holmes has just stepped out and might return at any moment, his pipe on the table, a case file open, the deerstalker hanging by the door. It's a monument to belief, to the power of story to make something that never existed feel more real than many things that did. Rest now, and let yourself drift on these thoughts like a boat on the Thames at evening. Somewhere, in the imagination, Holmes still sits in his chair, solving problems, playing his violin, waiting for the next mystery. When we meet again, we shall explore the final facets of this remarkable detective and the world he inhabits forever. Chapter 9. Let the evening deepen around you as we continue our gentle journey through the mysteries and marvels of Sherlock Holmes. Breathe slowly, and let each fact settle like a stone in a still pond, ripples spreading outward into sleep. Among the 4 novels featuring Sherlock Holmes, The Sign of 4 holds a special place. Published in 1890, this was the second Holmes novel, and it's here that Watson meets his future wife, Mary Morstan. The case involves a mysterious treasure from India, a stolen hoard of jewels that brings both fortune and tragedy to those who seek it. Holmes solves the mystery brilliantly, but in doing so, he ensures that Watson and Mary lose the treasure that might have made them wealthy. Holmes congratulates Watson on his engagement but laments that marriage will mean the end of their partnership. "I shall be a lonely man when you leave Baker Street," he tells Watson, and there's genuine sadness in those words, perhaps the closest Holmes comes to admitting he needs companionship. The stories contain numerous references to cases that Watson mentions but never fully describes, and these have become known among fans as the untold tales. There's the matter of the politician, the lighthouse, and the trained cormorant. The adventure of the aluminium crutch. The curious case of Ricoletti of the club foot and his abominable wife. Each reference is just a phrase, a title, a hint of some extraordinary adventure that remains forever in shadow. These untold tales tantalize us precisely because they're incomplete. Our imaginations fill in the gaps, making them perhaps more vivid than any story Doyle could have written. Holmes's retirement to Sussex to keep bees is not merely a postscript to his career, it represents a philosophical evolution. In his practical handbook on beekeeping, Holmes writes about the segregation of the queen, but one imagines his also writing about order, about systems, about the way individual elements work together to create something larger than themselves. The hive is like London in miniature, each bee playing its role, and Holmes can study it with the same fascination he once brought to criminal networks. But here, in the Sussex countryside, there's peace instead of darkness, creation instead of destruction. Watson's first name is revealed to be John, but his wife Mary occasionally calls him James in one story, another of those delightful inconsistencies that have kept scholars debating for decades. Perhaps Watson has a middle name, or perhaps Doyle simply made a mistake. The beauty is that these small errors make the stories feel more real, not less. Real people's histories have inconsistencies, memories blur, details shift. The perfect consistency of pure fiction can feel sterile. These little contradictions give the stories the texture of lived experience. In The Adventure of the Three Garridebs, Watson is shot and wounded, and Holmes's reaction reveals the depth of his feeling for his friend. When he sees Watson hurt, Holmes shows rare, raw emotion, his face goes white, and he speaks with a tenderness Watson has rarely heard. "You're not hurt, Watson? For God's sake, say that you are not hurt." It's one of the few moments when Holmes's carefully maintained emotional distance crumbles entirely, showing the love and fear beneath his rational exterior. Watson later writes that it was worth being wounded to see how much Holmes valued him. In that moment, the great detective is simply a man terrified of losing his closest friend. Holmes occasionally works for free or even pays his own expenses when a case interests him sufficiently or when clients cannot afford his fees. In The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet, a wealthy banker consults him about a precious artifact, but Holmes is equally willing to help a governess in The Adventure of the Copper Beeches who can pay him nothing. This egalitarian approach to justice, that the poor deserve the same brilliant advocacy as the rich, sets Holmes apart from many Victorian institutions that favored those who could pay. Holmes's justice is blind not only to evidence but to economics. The detective has a remarkable ability to remain motionless for extended periods, a skill he employs during stakeouts and observations. In several stories, Watson describes finding Holmes sitting perfectly still, sometimes for hours, so deeply focused on thought or observation that he seems almost to have left his body. This statue-like stillness contrasts sharply with his bursts of frenetic energy, creating a character of dramatic extremes, either absolutely still or ceaselessly moving, with little middle ground between. Holmes's knowledge of poisons is extensive and somewhat disturbing. He knows their symptoms, their sources, their effects on the human body in meticulous detail. In several cases, poison plays a crucial role. The Adventure of the Devil's Foot involves a deadly substance from Africa, while The Adventure of the Dying Detective sees Holmes pretending to be poisoned to trap a murderer. This expertise in toxicology reflects the Victorian fascination with poison as a murder weapon. It was seen as particularly insidious, an invisible killer that could strike without warning, turning the most domestic settings into scenes of death. In A Study in Scarlet, Holmes demonstrates his knowledge of sensational literature by writing an article about the science of deduction. He argues that from a single drop of water, a logician could infer the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara without having seen or heard of either. This philosophical approach, that the universe is connected, that small things reflect large principles, underlies all his detective work. Every tobacco ash, every footprint, every stain is a window into larger truths. The microcosm reveals the macrocosm, the particular illuminates the universal. Watson keeps his service revolver with him throughout most of the adventures, and is quite willing to use it when necessary. He shoots the Hound of the Baskervilles, fires at a cab to stop an escaping criminal, and generally serves as Holmes's protector when situations turn violent. This military background makes Watson more than just a chronicler, he's a bodyguard, a partner in danger, someone who can handle himself in a fight. Holmes, despite his skills at Baritsu, often relies on Watson's more conventional bravery and readiness with firearms. They complement each other perfectly. Holmes provides the brain, Watson provides the steadiness and courage, and together they form something greater than either could be alone. Rest now in the knowledge of these stories, these lives that never were yet somehow always are. Outside, London sleeps under its blanket of fog, and in Sussex, the bees hum in their hives. When we meet again for our final journey, we shall bring all these threads together and understand why Sherlock Holmes, more than any character in literature, refuses to die. Chapter 10. Welcome to our final journey together through the world of Sherlock Holmes. Let yourself sink into these last moments, these final facts, like settling into the deepest part of sleep where dreams and memory intertwine. Holmes's methods rely heavily on the examination of physical evidence, and is particularly expert at identifying different types of soil and clay. In The Adventure of the Priory School, he examines bicycle tracks and determines not only the direction of travel but the type of bicycle and the weight of the rider. He can distinguish the clay from one region of England from another, knowledge that seems arcane until it becomes the key to solving a case. This attention to geology, to the very earth beneath our feet, shows Holmes's belief that everything carries information, even dust has a story to tell if you know how to read it. The famous phrase, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth," appears in The Sign of 4, and it encapsulates Holmes's entire philosophy. This logical principle, sometimes called Holmesian deduction, has influenced not just detective work but scientific thinking more broadly. It's a statement of faith in reason, that truth exists, that it can be found, that careful thought will always win out over confusion and mystery. In an age of uncertainty, this confidence is deeply comforting, which perhaps explains why Holmes continues to resonate across generations. Holmes's favorite armchair is described as being near the fireplace on the left side as you face it, and it becomes so associated with him that Watson always refers to it as Holmes's chair. Imagine how many hours the detective spent in that chair, thinking, smoking, playing his violin, or simply staring into the fire while his extraordinary mind worked through problems. That chair is more than furniture, it's a throne of thought, a seat of contemplation where some of literature's greatest deductions were born. The detective occasionally takes on cases that involve no crime at all, mysteries that are puzzles rather than offenses against law. In The Adventure of the Yellow Face, Holmes actually reaches the wrong conclusion, one of the rare cases where his deduction fails him. He admits his error gracefully, asking Watson to whisper Norbury to him whenever he becomes too confident in his own abilities. This humility, this willingness to acknowledge fallibility, makes Holmes more human and more admirable than if he were infallible. Even the great detective can be wrong, and wisdom lies in admitting it. Watson's literary style evolves throughout the stories, becoming more assured and polished as he gains confidence as a writer. The early stories have a certain earnest quality, while later tales show Watson developing his narrative voice, learning how to build suspense, how to withhold and reveal information for maximum effect. In this way, Watson grows not just as Holmes's companion but as an artist in his own right, finding his own form of mastery parallel to Holmes's detective genius. Holmes expresses his admiration for certain criminals who display exceptional cleverness or originality in their methods. He speaks of some criminals almost fondly, respecting their ingenuity even as he works to bring them to justice. This moral complexity, the ability to appreciate criminal artistry while opposing it, makes Holmes more interesting than a simple crusader for law and order. He understands that intelligence and creativity exist independent of morality, and that one can admire the execution while condemning the intent. The relationship between Holmes and Watson is never explicitly labeled, but it remains one of literature's great friendships. They share rooms, adventures, dangers, and countless quiet evenings by the fire. They irritate each other, protect each other, and ultimately define each other. Holmes without Watson would be a lonely genius spinning in isolation. Watson without Holmes would be a solid, unremarkable doctor living a conventional life. Together, they create something magical, a partnership that has become the model for countless fictional duos that followed. In The Adventure of the Mazarin Stone, something unusual happens. The story is told in third person rather than from Watson's perspective, one of only two stories not narrated by Watson. This shift in perspective is jarring for readers accustomed to seeing Holmes through Watson's admiring eyes. Without Watson's warmth and humanity, Holmes becomes slightly colder, more mechanical. It demonstrates how essential Watson is not just to the stories but to Holmes himself. Watson doesn't just record Holmes's greatness. He makes that greatness accessible, relatable, human. Holmes's ultimate legacy is not any single case he solved, but the idea he represents that reason can triumph over chaos, that observation and logic can unravel any mystery, that truth exists and can be found by those patient and clever enough to seek it. In our modern world, where truth itself sometimes seems uncertain, where misinformation spreads faster than facts, the Holmes stories offer something precious. The reassurance that reality is knowable, that careful thought matters, that intelligence properly applied can cut through confusion to reach clarity. And so we come to the end of our 100 Facts, our gentle tour through the life and world of Sherlock Holmes. But this is not truly an ending, is it? Holmes lives on in every reader who picks up a story, in every adaptation that reimagines him for a new age, in every real detective who uses methods he popularized, in every person who believes that puzzles have solutions and mysteries have answers. He sits forever in that chair by the fire, fingers pressed together in thought, while Watson writes by lamplight and Mrs. Hudson climbs the stairs with tea. Outside, the fog curls through Baker Street, muffling the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant calls of street vendors. The game is always afoot, somewhere in the imagination, in that eternal Victorian London that exists not on any map but in the collective dream of millions of readers across more than a century. Sherlock Holmes never lived, yet he has never died. He was born in the mind of a young doctor trying to make ends meet, but he became something far greater, a myth, an ideal, a friend who waits in the pages of a book whenever we need him. And perhaps that's the greatest mystery of all, how something that never existed can be so undeniably, permanently real. Rest now, Dear listener, let sleep find you like fog rolling in from the Thames, soft and inevitable. The detective has solved his last case for tonight. The fire has burned low in the grate, and Watson has set down his pen. Baker Street is quiet, and all is well. All is well. Sleep now, sleep.